This was a very targeted strike in Poltava here. So it stands out for a lot of reasons. I think obviously this is a tremendous casualty toll. But why the Ukrainians say, why just 2 ballistic missiles hitting this facility? This is not what we usually see. And I should say, too, that while things are pretty dire for the Ukrainians in a lot of regards, the Russians, as they march toward Pokrovsk, are overextending themselves and stretching themselves very thin, and their losses are extreme. And we're still waiting for some of this information to come out because the scene seems like, at least right now, at this very moment, is still pretty locked down. But what the Ukrainians are announcing, 41 dead, 180 injured. This is certainly one of the largest strikes and fatality counts in months in my recent memory. I think probably one of the largest single casualty events of the entire war. I'll have to go back and double check that, but I'm fairly certain that that's the case. The first responders are reporting that they got to the scene as quickly as they did, and that they pulled 25 people out of the rubble of this building. This is used as a Ukrainian military training. They also say this is a telecommunications hub. Interestingly enough, on the 26th, just a few days ago, I drove through, stopped and had coffee not far from this location here. There's certainly a lot of soldiers in this area. What is standing out right now is that we have, over the last 2 weeks, been watching as these widespread air attacks blanket the country and target multiple different areas. Their traditional saturation attacks try and overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses. This did not come across as a massive air attack, at least as what I'm seeing right now. We didn't have reports of any other major downings of ballistics or drones or any a widespread alert that was sent out to civilians across the country. This was a very targeted strike in Poltava here. So it stands out for a lot of reasons. I think obviously this is a tremendous casualty toll. But why the Ukrainians say, why just 2 ballistic missiles hitting this facility? This is not what we usually see, especially this is pretty deep inside the country. This is central Ukraine. This is still a good ways away from the front lines.
And as you say, this new wave of attacks by Russia have been characterized by what seemingly a targeting of civilian infrastructure.
I think what we see right now is a escalation that's been taking place on both sides in these air attacks. It reflects what's happening on the ground. Obviously, the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk is still gaining ground. The Ukrainians are still making gains inside Russian territory. That is incredible. That's remarkable, and that's going to be a very remarkable element of this conflict and where it's going. At the same time, in the southeast, in the Pokrovsk area, mass evacuations. People are getting out of the area. They see the writing on the wall. The Russians are inching closer and closer. We hear that they're taking additional villages overnight, and the news of these villages that are falling on the way to Pokrovsk is coming through just about once a day. That's a major concern on those 2 fronts. So the ground situation has been deteriorating rapidly for both the Russians and the Ukrainians in different regards. So what's been taking place in the airs? Massive energy infrastructure attacks. The Ukrainians have been striking and hitting really hard these oil depots to the point where, for the first time, to my knowledge, over the course of this conflict, the Russians have now made private the energy and oil production numbers. That was reporting that was exclusive to the Kyiv Post last week. I believe, based on that reporting, and again, this is coming out of Russia, so it's very hard to say for any certainty what's true and what's not. But I believe that means that also some of the government ministers inside the Russian Federation are not going to be privy to some of these oil production numbers as well. So they're kind of insulating themselves. The ways that the Ukrainians have been striking civilian infrastructure, and we consider obviously oil infrastructure, civilian infrastructure for energy purposes, they've been hitting these oil refineries and the oil storage sites, and they've been able to do so even in the Moscow region. So you're seeing Ukrainians have great success get through Russian air defenses. What are the Russians doing? They're striking near power plants all throughout Ukraine. They struck a dam in Kyiv about a week and a half ago now. So this is escalating and reflecting a lot of the ground situation. Both sides are pushing very hard, and there doesn't seem to be any way to get off this escalation ladder right now. It just seems like both sides are going to keep going at it and keep hitting each other as hard as they can and hit each other where it hurts. We can't really say for certain how long this can last, because the Ukrainians are already in a really tough spot, and they're already having rolling blackouts all throughout the country, even in the West, which is emblematic of how dire some of the energy problems are for them.
The Ukrainians, of course, are asking for more support from the West to deal with these strikes. They do want more air defense missiles, of course. There's also demands for the use of US missiles to launch into Russia to try and hit some of these launch sites. Is that something that's likely to go ahead? Are Ukraine any further ahead with that request?
I think so. Yesterday, we saw the President Biden receive this question directly, which we haven't had him speak to this. There's, of course, been Jake Sullivan and different members of the Biden administration and the team that get to ask this question every day. But it's very rare that Biden himself has spoken on this directly. And he was on the way to, I think, the helicopter on the White House lawn. He stopped for questions and said that the Ukrainians know what we do and don't want them to do, essentially. So it seems like the Biden line has not changed, that they don't want to escalate this conflict and the Russians to perceive an American threat based on American Western weapons striking these air bases deep inside Russia. That said, we're getting to an interesting point in this conflict where I think we're seeing some late stage movements taking place. The Ukrainians going into Kursk. That's something that there's a lot at play here that makes it seem as though the Ukrainian mindset is we need to find some off-ramp to this conflict as fast as possible, because we cannot hold on much longer, and in a lot of ways they can't. If we get to that point and the Ukrainians are starting to get into some sort of desperation mode, using some of the weapons that they already have. They've announced that they've designed their own ballistic weapon in the last 2 weeks. They've also announced in the same time period that they've designed their own a jet-powered drone that carries about the same payload as a ballistic. So this is going to be that window where if the Ukrainians were to turn the tide of this conflict and be able to hit some of these Russian air bases that are creating widespread devastation, now would be the time where we would see something like that happen, I think. Would it be with Western weapons? You still need Western approval. There's a axiom, or at least when you talk with some of the soldiers in Ukraine about, if you really wanted to, could Zelensky use these weapons? He has them somewhere in, reserves. They're in Ukraine, and they're being used for other purposes the way that the U.S. wants them to be used. Could you see a moment when President Zelensky says, you know what, we're doing it, and uses these weapons for that purpose? There's a Ukrainian mindset that says there might be some mechanisms in place where the U.S. has made it so they would prevent such an eventuality, or prevent something for that to be able to happen. So it could be really interesting what we see happen in the next few weeks. This is a lot of movement before winter comes, and both sides are pushing really hard. And I should say too that while things are pretty dire for the Ukrainians in a lot of regards, the Russians, as they march toward Pokrovsk, are overextending themselves and stretching themselves very thin, and their losses are extreme. We don't know how much they can sustain this either, and they're exposing some pretty wide flanks in areas where the defenses they've destroyed, and these are just open fields. So if the Ukrainians could funnel them into this direction towards Pokrovsk and they expose one of these flanks, they could get cut off just the same. So it's a big gamble on the Russian end just as well.
And you've just returned from Ukraine. you were visiting there, Kursk, but other regions as well, especially Kharkiv, which has seen a lot of bombardment. Is there any sign of this bombardment having an impact on the morale of everyday citizens in Ukraine?
I think what stood out to me the most was that Kharkiv, the city, has emptied out. A lot fewer civilians are around than there were last summer. The mood and the atmosphere, and I should say too, especially a lot fewer young people are around the city. They've all been relocated in the West, especially for the start of the school year too. Which is today, I believe, or today or yesterday. No, it was today. While these attacks were taking place, the Kharkiv area in particular has been hit pretty hard throughout the conflict. But all of a sudden, these bombings on these apartment complexes, the death tolls, when we've been used to seeing the headlines being 2 or 3 people killed in some of these strikes. Well, last week, seen 7 killed and 50 plus injured, and the Ukrainian psyche is taking a huge hit. And I think in particular, the most devastating thing that's happened in the last few weeks for the Ukrainian psyche has been the image of the dead at that Kharkiv strike. It's just a horrific scene. You can't even describe it. And the poor 14-year-old girl who's dead on a park bench, and I don't wish that anyone will ever see the images of her final moments, because it's just the most horrific thing you'll ever see. The reporting in the local Ukrainian media is that her father went off to fight and has not been heard from, and that it's been months for her, and she'd been recovering from what is believed to be a tragic loss of her father on the front lines. And for this to happen to her is just devastating. And just, it's emblematic of the Russia's campaign, which is using glide bombs. These are not precision weapons. They're launched from bombers in Russian territory, and then they fly away so that they evade Ukrainian anti-air defenses. And they just pester. They just plop these bombs, massive bombs, in the center of town, hits the side of an apartment complex and a park. No military objectives in the area. There's nothing in that area that resembles anything that could be said as civilian military infrastructure. It's just apartment blocks, and this is a very obvious and evident war crime on the Russians, killing these civilians. And there's a widespread belief in the Ukrainian mindset right now as they speak to one another. And they speak to us too, any of the journalists that are in the area, that they think the Russians at this point, throughout the conflict, but in particular now, they think the Russians are just trying to break their spirit and just grind them and kill more and more civilians to just try and break the will of the Ukrainians, get them to relent and stop this fight.